We're going to start with some chapter 2 topics. And again, remember, the book is just the baseline, bare bones kind of intro stuff. And we're very much going to build on top of that. And the videos is where we start to do that. And certainly in some of the labs that we'll be doing as well. And some of these things intentionally were, kind of teased ahead in last chapter's video. So let's revisit some things that were spoken about there and start to build them out. And as this chapter goes on, we'll see them continuing to be enhanced. So you want to spend some time to get the general idea of the concepts. It's a big part of what we're doing and why they pay us so much to do this. And start to just build that familiarity over time. So again, you've got to make that investment. So there's, as mentioned, and with the comment there on line 748, two categories of data types in Java. There's the primitives, and again, those are just the simple values. That's a fixed set of types, and you can look those up, but those are like your ints and your doubles and your booleans. And remember, for variable declaration, like you've been reading about, remember the pattern, and we talked about this last chapter too, is that it's the type, some white space, the name based on the identifier rules you've read about, the assignment operator usually, because you can have a variable declared, but generally we need to put something in it. And again, whether that's coming from input or another variable or just a fixed or what we sometimes call literal value here, we're going to say, all right, I've got a primitive integer called primitive int, and it starts with the value 5. And you say, okay, sounds good. And again, remember that also for greater readability too, the primitives all start with lowercase, and as we'll see, the reference types, like we mentioned last chapter, start with uppercase. And again, those are what we're sometimes called objects. They're going to be a combination of data and methods. You've started to see a bit about those in chapter 2, and we're going to continue to build that out as quickly as we possibly can. Now, we have variables, but the whole object doesn't live in a box, and we're going to find this is going to give us some flexibility, and we're going to see this a little bit later on in one of the other videos in this chapter, that when on like line 17, and note that the variable declaration syntax remains the same. It's the type, in this case, the point type, and that's one of the built-in types that represents a pair of x and y coordinates. And note that I went ahead and imported it here on line 2 so I could use it. Didn't have to write it. White space, name of the variable some point, but as we'll talk more about, a reference variable, again, does not store the object, it stores the location. It's an association with some particular, what we call an instance of an object. What we're going to see is when we write classes, those are like blueprints, or you could say cookie cutters, stencils, whatever analogy works for you. That defines what it is. But then when we actually start, using the blueprints or using the cookie cutter to stamp out cookies, that's when we're creating instances of something. And often, when we're doing an assignment to a reference type, we're going to assign a new instance that we're creating, and that's where the new keyword comes in. We'll see later in the chapter that's not necessarily the case. We may assign a reference to an instance that already exists. Now, when we create a class, we call a special method we'll be talking about called a constructor. That will be named after the type that we're creating, and we'll take one or more arguments. And later on in the chapter, we'll talk about the difference between an argument and a parameter. Remember, when you created the scanners before, you passed in an argument which was, okay, what do you want me to scan in the case of a point? And we will see that classes can have multiple constructors, or what we call overloaded constructors. This says one of the ways you can create point is to pass it two primitive ints for the corresponding x and y. And note that those little captions in there for x and y, that was something IntelliJ did to be super helpful. So I want to create a new point with x 100, y 100. As far as the other ways that you can construct a point, look at that API section later in the chapter. That shows where you can look up and find information about all the classes. So you can look up the point class and see, hey, what can I do with a point class? And more on that, again, also this chapter. Here's something to revisit that we talked about last chapter for reasons that we will eventually explain and you will understand, is that print line can print out any kind of data in the present or in the future. And the nice thing is println doesn't know how to do that, but it knows how to get that information. For primitives, that's one set that we will talk about. So remember, like we've seen, we can just put that primitive value there, and that will convert that to a string like we saw last chapter. Remember the assignment operator, just like we saw here, to do that when we create a variable, or what we call initialization or initializing a variable. Down here, we're going, oh, okay, primitive it was that, but now I need it to do this. And remember, the box can only store one thing, so the other value gets checked. If you need that value to be saved, you need to make sure that you assign that to another variable first. And you've seen stuff about assignment within the book. And note that when we come here, we have line 26 is exactly the same as line 20. However, it's always the current contents of primitive int. And based on line 25, even though we had only one line of code between those two identical print line statements, we're going to get a different answer because the value, the variable that we're putting the current contents of in the output has changed. And here's a quick look ahead on working with reference types, and we're going to build this out as we go through the chapter. Remember, up on line 17, we created an instance of some point. Now we can actually just put some point in a print line. And regardless of what type of object it is, println will know what to do. Again, we'll get to that, and it's good stuff. But often what we do, we may not want the default way to display it, because every object will provide a default way to display itself in a print line. And we may say, well, maybe we just want some subset of that, or we want to put it in some way that we want to get it. And each of the objects will have some, and this is something you can look up in the API, some methods, and in this case what we call an instance method. We'll talk about the differences more with instance methods and static methods. An instance method means I want something from a particular instance. And the phrasing of this is very important, and it's going to help you understand it in the long run. So get in the flow of this, because I'm going to ask you to do it at some point anyway. Is if I said, hey, I've got this point in some point, and I just need the x value. We'll keep it simple for now. So here, what I'm saying, and here's the dot notation, because it says I don't want all of some point, I want some specific thing from some point. And that's where the dot notation comes in. And getX is an instance method. Every single instance of point that exists or will ever exist will always have the ability for you to call in conjunction with that instance the getX method. And basically you're saying, hey, I don't know you, I just know you're a point, and I know that if I ask you via the getX method, you'll tell me what your x value is. So hey, whatever instance of point some point is currently referencing, call the getX method that is guaranteed to be available and get me the x of that specific point. And again, that's a lot early on, but that's really more the crux of what we're going to be talking about this semester. And we're going to build that out in one of the later variables, later videos rather, this chapter. Well, variables too, for that matter. So if we run this, and note that we had primitive int. Remember, that was initially declared as 5. So when we got to line 20, what was primitive int at that moment? Well, it was 5. We get down to line 26. What is primitive int right now? Well, it got changed on line 25, and it says we got 10. Didn't she used to be 5? 5 who? Because remember, on line 25, the 10 got assigned, and the old value primitive int got chucked. Now here, note for the last one, and again, this is going to be very important going forward, is that it says, hey, some point, and again, note, we can change what some point is assigned, just like we did here with primitive int, and we're going to see that later in the chapter, is I am a point whose x is 100. So it says, hey, some point, you got an x and a y, give me your x. And it said, sure, here's 100. And interestingly too, and we'll talk more about this, we gave it an int but the default is we get it back as a double. Kind of interesting. So again, let that soak in. And like with all these videos too, take some time if you want to, go back and re-listen to parts of it again. Totally encouraged to do that. Just like if you were reading something, you would go back and reread it. Please do that with the videos, because again, the really interesting, powerful stuff that we're going to be focusing a lot of this class on is actually going to be in the videos, and the book is merely just an introduction. So enjoy that, soak that in, and we'll see you in the next video.